Welcome to Enigma of the Unknown, where we explore the darkest and most spine-chilling tales that keep you awake at night. Tonight, we dive into the unsettling fear of being home alone, from sinister knocks on windows to chilling reflections in computer screens. These 7 terrifying stories reveal just how haunting solitude can be. Turn down the lights, lock your doors, and prepare to confront the horrors of being home alone. Story number 1. I was 10 years old when the whispers began. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if things would have been different if I hadn't been alone that afternoon. But fate has a funny way of weaving threads we can't untangle. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind where the golden leaves danced in the wind and the sky was a clear, endless blue. Mom had to run some errands and left me alone for a few hours. "Be good, Emma," she said, kissing my forehead. "I'll be back before dinner." I loved having the house to myself. Felt like my own little kingdom. I spent the first hour drawing pictures at the kitchen table, the sunlight streaming through the windows casting warm patterns on the floor. After a while, I decided to play in my room. As I climbed the stairs, I felt a slight chill, but shrugged it off. Autumn was settling in. After all, pushing open my bedroom door, I was greeted by the familiar sight of my neatly made bed, shelves lined with books, and stuffed animals perched in their usual spots. I sat on the rug and began sorting through my toys, deciding who would join me on today's adventure. Lost in my game, I almost didn't hear it. A soft giggle, barely audible, like the tinkling of distant bells. I paused, looking up. "Hello," I called out, half expecting Mom to have returned early. Silence. Shrugging, I returned to my toys. But then it came again. Slightly louder, a child's laughter, but not my own. It seemed to be coming from within the room. A prickle of unease ran down my spine. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice wavering. No answer. I stood up, scanning the room. The closet door was closed, the windows shut tight. Maybe it was the neighbor's kids playing outside. Deciding that must be it, I tried to ignore the fluttering in my stomach. But as I sat back down, the giggling resumed, unmistakably closer this time. It sounded like it was coming from under the bed. My heart began to pound. I stared at the edge of my bed, the space beneath it hidden in shadow. Gathering my courage, I got on my hands and knees, slowly inching forward. "Who's there?" I whispered, taking a deep breath. I lifted the bed skirt and peered into the darkness. 2 gleaming eyes stared back at me. I yelped, scrambling backward and hitting the dresser behind me. My mind raced. Couldn't be. I had thrown that doll away months ago. Mirabelle. She was my favorite doll once. A beautiful porcelain figure with golden curls and a frilly blue dress. Grandma had given her to me on my 7th birthday. But over time, Mirabelle began to unsettle me. I'd find her in places I didn't remember leaving her, her glass eyes seeming to follow me around the room. One day, after a particularly vivid nightmare featuring her, I decided I'd had enough. Mom helped me pack her away, and we donated her along with other old toys. But here she was, lying under my bed, her dress pristine, her blonde ringlets perfectly in place. Except for one thing, her eyes. They were wider than I remembered, almost unnaturally so, and her lips were curved into a subtle smile. "How did you get here?" I murmured, more to myself than to the doll. The giggling started again, but this time, Mirabelle's painted lips parted ever so slightly. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This wasn't possible. Dolls don't just reappear after being given away. They don't move on their own, and they certainly don't laugh. I had to be imagining this. Maybe I was tired, or perhaps I had found another doll that looked similar and forgotten about it. Mustering my nerve, I reached out to grab her, intending to prove to myself that she was just a doll. As my fingers brushed against the cool porcelain of her arm, her head turned sharply to face me. "Come play with me, Emma," a voice whispered. I screamed, yanking my hand back and knocking over a stack of books in the process. I stumbled to my feet and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was racing, and tears blurred my vision. This couldn't be happening. I fumbled for the phone in the hallway, dialing Mom's number with shaking hands. Pick up, pleaded. Hi, you've reached Laura. Sorry I missed your call. I hung up before the beep. I didn't want to leave a message that would worry her. Instead, I decided to wait downstairs until she returned. I curled up on the couch, turning on the TV for some background noise. Cartoons always made me feel better. As the familiar characters filled the screen, I began to calm down. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. A thud echoed from upstairs. I muted the TV, straining to listen. Thud, thud, footsteps, slow and deliberate, descending the staircase. I froze. Mom, I called out weakly, though I knew she wasn't home. The footsteps grew louder, each one causing the old wood to creak. I wanted to run, to hide, but my body wouldn't cooperate. Around the corner of the hallway, a shadow appeared, a small figure, just the height of my waist. Mirabelle stepped into view, walking on her own, her porcelain feet tapping lightly on the hardwood floor, her head tilted to the side, and her eyes fixed on me. "Don't you want to play?" she asked in that same chilling whisper. I let out a strangled cry, scrambling off the couch and backing away. "This isn't real," I stammered. "You're not real." She took another step forward. "You left me, Emma. That wasn't very nice." "I'm sorry," I blurted, tears streaming down my face. "Please, just go away." She smiled wider. "We can be friends again, forever." The room grew colder, the lights flickering overhead. The shadows around Mirabelle seemed to deepen, stretching toward me like grasping hands. Desperate, I looked for an escape. The front door was just a few feet away. Summoning all my courage, I darted past her, yanking the door open and sprinting outside. I didn't stop running until I reached the sidewalk. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. I looked back at the house, half expecting to see Mirabelle following me, but the doorway was empty. A neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, was tending to her garden next door. She looked up, noticing my distressed state. "Emma, dear, what's wrong?" she asked, concern evident in her eyes. I hesitated. How could I explain what had just happened without sounding crazy? I thought I saw something in the house," I managed to say. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to me. "Are you alone? Where's your mother?" "She went out. She should be back soon." Mrs. Thompson frowned. "Well, why don't you come over to my place until she returns?" I nodded gratefully. "Thank you." Inside her cozy kitchen, the aroma of freshly baked cookies filled the air. She handed me a glass of milk and a warm cookie. "Now, tell me what scared you." I took a deep breath. "It's silly, but I thought I saw my old doll, Mirabelle, the one we gave away." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and where did you see her?" "Under my bed." Then she walked downstairs. Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted slightly, a hint of something I couldn't quite place. "You know, sometimes our minds play tricks on us when we're alone, especially in a big house like yours." "Maybe," I said quietly, though I wasn't convinced. She patted my hand. "Why don't you stay here until your mother gets back?" "Okay." Hours passed, and darkness settled outside. Mom finally arrived, her car pulling into our driveway. I thanked Mrs. Thompson and hurried out to meet her. "Emma, what are you doing over here?" Mom asked, surprised. I got scared being alone," I admitted. She looked concerned. "Oh, sweetie, I'm sorry. I thought you'd be okay for a few hours." "It's fine. Can we just go inside?" She nodded, wrapping an arm around me as we walked back home. Inside, everything appeared normal. The lights were on, and the warmth of the house was welcoming. "Do you want to talk about it?" Mom asked as we settled on the couch. I hesitated, then decided to tell her everything. As I recounted the events, her expression shifted from concern to disbelief. "Emma, honey, dolls don't come to life," she said gently. I know how it sounds, but I saw her. Maybe it was a bad dream, she suggested. You've been under a lot of stress with school. I'm not making it up, I insisted. She sighed. Tell you what, let's go check your room together. If Mirabelle is there, we'll deal with it. Reluctantly, I agreed. We climbed the stairs, and I clung to her hand, pushing open my bedroom door. We stepped inside. The room was just as I'd left it. No sign of Mirabelle. See, Mom said softly. Nothing to worry about. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe you're right. She kissed my forehead. Why don't you get ready for bed? I'll be right downstairs if you need me. Okay. After changing into my pajamas, I slipped under the covers, still feeling uneasy. I reached over to turn off the bedside lamp when I heard it, the soft rustle of fabric. I glanced toward the closet. The door was slightly open, a sliver of darkness within. Mom! I called out, but there was no response. The rustling grew louder, and the closet door creaked open further. Mirabelle stepped out, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. You shouldn't have left me, she whispered. I screamed, bolting out of bed and racing downstairs. Mom! Mom! She met me at the bottom of the stairs. Alarmed. What's wrong? She's here. Mirabelle is in my room. Frustration flashed across her face. Emma, enough. This isn't funny. But I'm telling the truth. She took a deep breath. Fine. Stay here. I watched as she marched upstairs. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Then, a blood-curdling scream echoed from above. Mom! I shouted, fear gripping me. I forced myself to move, ascending the stairs despite the terror that threatened to paralyze me. At the doorway to my room, I found Mom standing rigid, her eyes fixed on the bed. Mirabelle sat atop the pillows, cradling another doll, a smaller version of herself. Do you believe me now? I whispered. Mom nodded slowly, her face pale. We're leaving. Now. We backed out of the room. And as we did, Mirabelle's head turned to follow us. Don't go, she called after us, her voice echoing unnaturally. We didn't stop until we were outside, the cold night air sharp against our skin. Mom fumbled with her keys, and we got into the car. Where are we going? I asked. Away from here, she replied, starting the engine. As we drove away, I looked back at the house. In the window of my bedroom, I saw her, a small silhouette watching us leave. We checked into a hotel that night. Mom made several calls, and the next day, we met with a woman named Mrs. Harlow, who specialized in the paranormal. After hearing our story, she agreed to cleanse the house. You should have told me you had a doll from the Rosewood collection, she said gravely. What's that? Mom asked. An infamous line of dolls believed to be conduits for restless spirits, Mrs. Harlow explained. They were all supposed to be destroyed years ago. Grandma gave her to me, I said quietly. Mrs. Harlow nodded. Sometimes, objects carry more history than we realize. She performed a ritual at the house, and afterward, assured us that Mirabelle was no longer a threat. We returned home, but things were never quite the same. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and the shadows seemed to cling to the corners a bit longer than they should. We eventually moved, leaving the house and Mirabelle behind. Years later, I still dream of her sometimes. In my nightmares, she's standing at the foot of my bed, whispering for me to come play. I don't know what became of the house or if anyone else has encountered her since. But sometimes, when the night is quiet and the wind is still, I think I hear a faint giggle, echoing from the depths of forgotten memories. And I wonder if some doors, once opened, can ever truly be closed. Story number 2. I was 14 when it happened, but even now, years later, the memory clings to me like a shadow. It was a chilly autumn evening, and my parents had gone out for the night, leaving me alone in the house for the first time. I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness, but mostly I relished the freedom. I wrapped myself in a cozy blanket, settled onto the couch, and flicked on the TV to my favorite show. The living room was warm, illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves and causing the branches to sway. Occasionally, a gust would send the old oak's limbs tapping gently against the window, a familiar sound that usually soothed me. Halfway through the episode, I heard a light tapping on the window pane. Tap, tap, tap. It was so faint I almost dismissed it as part of the show. But during a quiet moment, came again, slightly louder. Tap, tap, tap. I glanced over but saw nothing beyond the glass except the vague outline of trees against the night sky. Just the wind, I muttered to myself, pulling the blanket tighter. I returned my attention to the TV, trying to ignore the unease creeping into my mind. A few minutes passed before the tapping resumed, this time more insistent. Tap, 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 tap. It had a rhythm now, almost deliberate. My heart began to beat a little faster. I muted the television, leaving the room in near silence, save for the steady tapping that continued unabated. Probably a loose shutter, I thought, trying to quell my growing anxiety. But deep down, I knew we didn't have shutters. Summoning my courage, I stood up and walked slowly toward the window. Each step felt heavy, the floorboards creaking softly beneath my feet. The tapping grew louder as I approached, echoing in the quiet room. I hesitated a foot away from the glass, the reflection of the TV casting a faint light that obscured the outside. Taking a deep breath, I leaned in to peer through the window. First, all I saw was darkness. Then, a flash of movement caught my eye. The light from the TV illuminated just enough for me to make out the silhouette of a man standing mere inches from the glass. I gasped, stumbling backward. The man's features were hidden in shadow, but his presence was unmistakable. He stood unnaturally still, except for one hand slowly raising to the window. Tap, tap, tap. Panic surged through me. I wanted to scream, but terror choked the sound. My mind raced. Was this some prank? A neighbor in need? But instinct told me something was very wrong. Finally finding my voice, I let out a piercing scream and turned to run. Behind me, the tapping intensified, becoming a frantic pounding. I dashed up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest, slamming my bedroom door shut. I locked it and grabbed my phone to dial 911. 911. What's your emergency? The operator answered calmly. Someone's outside my house. He's trying to get in. I whispered urgently, afraid he might hear me. Stay on the line. What's your address? She asked. I gave her the information, my hands trembling. She assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay where I was. Moments later, I heard the sound of shattering glass from downstairs. My breath caught as tears welled in my eyes. He was inside. He's in the house. I whispered to the operator. Find a safe place to hide. She instructed. Stay quiet. I crawled into my closet, nestling behind a row of hanging clothes. The darkness was suffocating, but I didn't dare turn on a light. Every sound seemed amplified, the ticking of my watch, the muffled thud of footsteps ascending the stairs. The floorboards creaked outside my room. He was just on the other side of the door. I clasped a hand over my mouth to stifle a sob. A rattling at the doorknob sent a jolt of fear through me. He was trying to get in. Finding it locked, he began pounding on the door. Each slam echoed my racing heartbeat. Police are almost there, the operator said softly in my ear. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. Silence. I strained to hear any movement but caught nothing. Minutes felt like hours. Red and blue lights flashed through the gaps in the closet door. I heard voices downstairs, authoritative, commanding. Police department. Is anyone here? I stayed put until a firm knock sounded on my bedroom door. This is the police. Are you in there? I burst from the closet, flinging the door open. 2 officers stood there, and relief washed over me like a wave. He's in the house. I managed to say. They escorted me downstairs and outside to a waiting patrol car where another officer stayed with me. The house was eerily quiet now, the front door ajar, glass shards glittering on the porch from the broken window. After what felt like an eternity, the officers emerged. "We've searched the premises," one said. "There's no sign of anyone." "That's impossible," I protested. "He was here. I heard him come upstairs." They exchanged glances. "There's no one inside now. We'll do another sweep to be sure." They combed through the house again, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Nothing. "Could it have been a branch against the window?" one officer suggested gently. I shook my head vehemently. "No, I saw him. He was standing right at the window. He broke in. I heard the glass." The officer paused. "We did find the window broken, but there's no evidence of entry, no footprints, no signs of disturbance inside." I felt a cold dread settling in. Was I losing my mind? "Tell you what," he continued, "we'll station a car outside for the rest of the night, but you might want to call your parents to come home." They stayed until my parents arrived, their faces etched with worry. I recounted everything, but despite their concern, I sensed they doubted me. "Maybe it was just a nightmare, sweetheart." My mother said soothingly, "It wasn't a nightmare." I insisted. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the house set me on edge. The image of the man's silhouette replayed in my mind, refusing to fade. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the windows, I went downstairs. The broken glass had been cleaned up, the window temporarily patched. I stood where he had stood, looking out into the yard. Everything seemed so normal. That's when I noticed smudges on the inside of the window, fingerprints smeared across the glass. My heart skipped a beat. I reached out to touch them, and a chill ran down my spine. They were on the inside. "Mom!" I called out, backing away. She hurried into the room. "What is it?" I pointed at the fingerprints. He was inside the house, her face pale. "But the police said." "They were wrong," I whispered. We called the police again, and this time they took it more seriously. They dusted for prints, confirming that the marks were indeed on the inside. The realization that someone had been inside while I was alone sent a ripple of fear through the entire family. Over the next few days, we upgraded our security, new locks, motion sensors, even a security system with cameras. But despite the precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One evening, as I reviewed footage from the security cameras, I noticed something unsettling. In the recordings from the night of the incident, a figure could be seen slipping into the house hours before I heard the tapping. He moved with deliberate stealth, avoiding the main areas, disappearing into the shadows. But the most disturbing part was when he appeared at the foot of the stairs, looking up toward my room. He stood there for several minutes before moving out of frame. The timestamp matched when I was hiding in my closet. We showed the footage to the police, but they couldn't identify the man. He had concealed his face, wearing a hooded jacket and gloves. The only clear detail was a distinctive tattoo on his wrist, a serpent coiled around a dagger. Despite their efforts, the man was never found. The investigation eventually dwindled, leaving us with more questions than answers. We moved shortly after, seeking a fresh start, but the sense of security I'd once felt was gone. Every stranger was a potential threat, every shadow a hiding place. Years later, I still glance over my shoulder in crowded places. I double-check locks, avoid being alone whenever possible, and sleep with a light on. Therapy helped to some extent, but some wounds run too deep. I share my story not to instill fear, but to urge vigilance. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, probably is. And remember that sometimes, the real monsters aren't the ones under your bed or in your closet. They're the ones who hide in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. So if you ever hear a tapping at your window late at night, think twice before dismissing it, because you never know who or what might be on the other side. Story number 3. I still remember that evening as if it were yesterday. The sun had dipped below the Chicago skyline, casting long shadows that danced across my living room floor. The hum of city life was muted by the double-pane windows of my townhouse, leaving me enveloped in a cocoon of silence. I was alone for the weekend. My husband, Mark, was away on a business trip, and I had the entire place to myself. I decided to indulge in a quiet night. After a warm bath, I slipped into my favorite pajamas, poured myself a glass of red wine, and settled onto the couch with a novel I'd been meaning to finish. The soft glow of the lamp bathed the room in a gentle light, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly at peace. Around 9 p.m., just as the protagonist was about to unravel the mystery, my cell phone buzzed on the coffee table. Startling me, the screen displayed an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello." For a few seconds, there was only static. Then, a man's voice, rough and low. "I'm in your basement. I'll be coming up soon." A cold chill raced down my spine. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. He chuckled softly. "See you soon." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding. It had to be a prank, maybe one of Mark's friends playing a joke. Shaking my head, I set the phone aside and tried to return to my book, but the words blurred on the page. Minutes later, I heard a faint creaking noise. The old house was full of sounds, with settling, pipes groaning, but this was different. It was rhythmic, deliberate, footsteps ascending the basement stairs. I froze, listening intently. The footsteps grew louder, each one sending a jolt of fear through me. This couldn't be happening. Gathering my courage, I called out, "Mark, is that you?" Even as I said it, I knew how absurd it was. Mark was miles away. Silence. I grabbed my phone and dialed Mark's number, straight to voicemail. Of course, the footsteps resumed, slow and methodical. Whoever was down there was taking their time. Panic took over. I sprang from the couch, bolted to the front door, and yanked it open. The crisp night air hit my face as I stumbled onto the porch. Without looking back, I sprinted to my neighbor's house 2 doors down. Mrs. Collins answered after my frantic knocking. "Julia? What's wrong?" "Someone's in my house," I gasped. "They said they were in my basement." Her eyes widened. "Come inside. We'll call the police." She ushered me into her living room, locking the door behind us. As she dialed 911, I peered out the window toward my house, half expecting to see a shadowy figure emerging from the front door. The police arrived within 10 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. 2 officers approached the Collins doorstep, and I hurried out to meet them. "You called about an intruder?" one asked, his expression professional but concerned. I nodded vigorously. "Yes, a man called me. He said he was in my basement. I heard footsteps. I ran out. Did you see anyone?" "No, but I heard him. Please, can you check?" "Of course. Stay here." They drew their weapons and proceeded toward my house. I watched anxiously as they entered through the still open front door. Mrs. Collins stood beside me, her hand resting reassuringly on my shoulder. "It's going to be okay," she whispered. Several agonizing minutes passed before the officers reappeared. "We searched the house," one of them said as they walked back. "There's no sign of anyone inside." I stared at them in disbelief. "But he called me. I heard him coming up the stairs." They exchanged a glance. "We did find this in the basement." He held up an evidence bag containing a cheap-looking cell phone. "That's not mine," I said. "It was on the floor near the stairs," he explained. There were muddy footprints leading to the back door, which was unlocked. I felt a wave of nausea, but I locked all the doors. I always do. "It's possible he exited before we arrived," the officer said gently. "We'll take the phone back to the station, see if we can find any prints or data." "Am I in danger?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We'll increase patrols in the area, he assured me. In the meantime, is there somewhere you can stay tonight? Mrs. Collins squeezed my shoulder. She can stay with me. I spent the night in her guest room, but sleep was elusive. Every creak of the house set my nerves on edge. By morning, exhaustion had settled into my bones. The next day, Mark returned home, frantic after hearing my messages. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there," he said, pulling me into a tight embrace. "We'll get to the bottom of this." We installed new locks, added security cameras, and even adopted a big, protective dog named Rex. For a while, the added measures brought me a semblance of peace. But then the calls started again, always from an unknown number, always the same raspy voice. "Miss me. Rex is a good dog. Does he sleep in your room?" Basements can be such lonely places. Each time, I'd report the calls to the police. They changed my number multiple times, but somehow, he always found it. One evening, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of me, taken from outside the living room window. In the picture, I was sitting on the couch, reading the same night he'd first called. I showed it to the police, but without a postmark or any distinguishing features. There was little they could do. "Keep your doors locked," the detective advised, "and don't hesitate to call if anything else happens." Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the house was palpable. Mark tried to put on a brave face, but I could see the worry etched in his features. One night, as a storm raged outside, we were jolted awake by Rex's ferocious barking. He was at the basement door, growling and snapping. Mark grabbed a baseball bat from under the bed. "Stay here," he instructed. "Be careful," pleaded. He crept down the hallway, Rex at his side. Moments later, I heard a crash, followed by a shout. Couldn't stay put. Heart pounding. I followed. At the top of the basement stairs, I found Mark staring down into the darkness. The door hung ajar, the lock broken. "He's gone," Mark said, his knuckles white as he gripped the bat. We called the police yet again. They searched the basement and found more muddy footprints leading to a small window. His pain shattered. "This is escalating," the detective admitted. "We're going to assign an officer to watch the house." Despite their efforts, the sense of violation was overwhelming. We decided it was time to leave. We put the house on the market and moved to a different part of the city, hoping to escape the nightmare. For a while, life regained a sense of normalcy. We changed our numbers, kept our address unlisted, and started to relax. But peace was fleeting. One afternoon, as I returned home from the grocery store, my phone buzzed. Without thinking, I answered. "Hello." Silence. Then, that familiar rasp. "Found you." I dropped the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. When Mark came home, I was a wreck. "He's back," I sobbed. "He found us." "How is that possible?" Mark demanded. "We've been so careful." Desperation turned into determination. We hired a private investigator, a grizzled man named Harris with a reputation for finding the unfindable. Harris dug deep. He traced the disposable phones, analyzed the patterns, and finally, after weeks of relentless work, he had a lead. "His name is Daniel Reese," Harris told us, ex-con with a history of stalking and harassment. He becomes obsessed, fixates on his targets. "Why me?" I asked, bewildered. "Sometimes, there's no reason other than opportunity," Harris said grimly. "But now that we have a name, we can take action." With this information, the police obtained a warrant. They found Daniel holed up in a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. In his room were photographs of me, schedules of my daily routines, even a layout of our new house. He was arrested and charged. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by a lingering unease. Daniel was behind bars, yet the memories of his torment remained like scars. We tried to move on. Mark and I focused on rebuilding our lives, finding joy in the small moments. and cherishing the safety we now felt. Months later, on a crisp autumn day, I received a letter in the mail. There was no return address. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 words scrawled in familiar handwriting: "Miss me." My vision blurred as I read the accompanying news clipping. Daniel Reese had escaped during a prison transfer. Fear gripped me anew. The police were notified immediately. They assured us they were doing everything possible to locate him. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound was amplified: the ticking clock, the rustle of leaves outside, the creaking of the house settling. Around midnight, Rex began to growl low in his throat. He stood at attention near the front door. His ears perked. Mark grabbed the baseball bat, and I armed myself with a kitchen knife. We waited, tense and silent. A shadow passed by the window. "Who's there?" Mark shouted. No answer. Then, a familiar voice from just beyond the door. "I'm in your basement. I'll be coming up soon." Rage and fear surged within me. "Leave us alone," I screamed. Laughter echoed, chilling and taunting. Sirens wailed in the distance. Our security system had alerted the authorities. Moments later, police cars screeched to a halt outside. Officers flooded the yard, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They found Daniel hiding behind the house, clutching a knife. He was apprehended without resistance, a sinister smile playing on his lips. As they led him away, he turned to look at me, his eyes void of humanity. "This isn't over," he whispered, but it was. Daniel was sentenced to life in a maximum security prison. We took out restraining orders, fortified our home, and did everything possible to ensure our safety. Yet, even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling of his presence lingering like a specter. Every unexpected phone call, every creak in the night, sends my heart racing. We moved once more, this time to a new state under new names, hoping to leave the past behind. But some shadows are inescapable. They cling to you, a constant reminder of the fragility of safety. I share my story not for sympathy but as a caution. Be vigilant, trust your instincts, and if you ever receive a call from someone claiming to be in your basement, don't dismiss it as a prank, because sometimes the monsters are real, and they're closer than you think. Story number 4. I never considered myself easily spooked. Growing up in a bustling city, I'd become accustomed to the constant hum of life around me. The sirens, the chatter, the footsteps on the pavement outside my window. So when I moved into a small, off-campus apartment for my junior year of college, the quiet was both a relief and an adjustment. It was a quaint little place, a 2-story house converted into separate units. I occupied the ground floor, and the upstairs apartment had been vacant for months. The landlord assured me he'd let me know when someone new moved in. Until then, I enjoyed the solitude, using the peace to focus on my studies. It was a crisp October weekend when it all began. Most of my classmates had gone home or were out partying, but I had a paper to finish. That Saturday evening, I settled into my worn but comfortable armchair in the living room, a cup of tea steaming on the side table, and a stack of reference books at my feet. The only sounds were the rustling of pages and the occasional creak of the old house settling. Around 9 p.m., as I was deep into analyzing a particularly dense paragraph, I heard it, a faint creaking from above, like someone taking a careful step. I froze, listening intently. Silence. I shook it off as the building adjusting to the dropping temperature and returned to my reading. Minutes later, the sound came again, more distinct this time. Footsteps, unmistakably, slow, deliberate, as if someone were pacing the length of the upstairs apartment. My heart rate quickened. Perhaps the landlord had found a new tenant and forgotten to mention it. I decided to call him, just to ease my mind. Reaching for my phone, I dialed his number, my fingers slightly trembling. "Hello," his gruff voice answered after a few rings. "Hi, Mr. Jenkins. It's Lily from Elm Street." "Ah, Lily, what can I do for you?" I was just wondering if someone moved into the upstairs apartment. I think I hear footsteps. There was a pause. No, not yet. Still looking for the right tenant. Why do you ask? I hesitated. I thought I heard someone walking around up there. He chuckled lightly. Old houses make funny noises, especially at night. Nothing to worry about. I forced a laugh. Yeah, you're probably right. Thanks. Anytime, dear. You have a good night now. Hanging up, I felt a knot form in my stomach. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was just the house. Returning to my chair, I tried to immerse myself back into my work. An hour passed without incident, and I began to relax. The wind picked up outside, a low howl seeping through the windowsills. Just as I was considering calling it a night, the footsteps resumed. This time, they were quicker, more urgent, moving back and forth directly above me. I stood up, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The sounds upstairs stopped abruptly, gathering every ounce of courage. I decided to investigate, grabbing my keys and a flashlight. I wasn't sure if the hallway lights upstairs would be on. I stepped out into the foyer. The staircase leading to the second floor was narrow and steep. Each step groaned under my weight, the old wood protesting after years of neglect. At the top, I found the door to the upstairs apartment slightly ajar. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Is anyone there?" Silence. I pushed the door open wider, the hinges squealing. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating an empty living space covered in a thin layer of dust. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the air was stale. Feeling a bit foolish, I ventured a few steps inside. The room was empty. I checked the small kitchen and bathroom, nothing. No signs of life. Relieved yet unsettled, I retreated, pulling the door firmly shut behind me. Back in my apartment, I double-checked the locks on all windows and doors before heading to bed. I told myself it was all in my head, a product of stress and an overactive imagination. Sleep came fitfully. I tossed and turned, shadows from the tree outside casting eerie shapes across my walls. Sometime in the night, I awoke with a start. The room was cold, my breath visible in the sliver of moonlight peeking through the curtains. That's when I felt it, a presence, heavy and oppressive, at the foot of my bed. My heart thudded against my ribcage. I didn't dare move. Slowly, I reached over to my bedside table, fingers fumbling for the lamp switch. With a click, the room flooded with warm light. Standing at the end of my bed was a man. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in outdated clothing, a frayed suit that looked decades old. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were a void, dark and hollow. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. We locked eyes, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he vanished. One blink, and the space where he stood was empty. Gasping, I scrambled out of bed, backing into the corner of the room. My mind raced to make sense of what I'd just seen. Was I dreaming? Hallucinating? Gathering my courage, I approached the spot where he'd been. The floor was icy cold. That's when I noticed it. On my pillow was a wet handprint, the outline of long, slender fingers shimmering under the lamplight. I touched it tentatively. The moisture was real, seeping into the fabric. The chill seeped into my fingertips, sending a shiver down my spine. I knew then that this was no mere nightmare. Grabbing my phone, I called the police. My voice shook as I explained the situation, half expecting them not to believe me. To their credit, they arrived promptly. 2 officers conducted a thorough search of the apartment. They checked every room, every closet, even the crawl space in the attic. Nothing was out of place, and there was no sign of forced entry. One of them, Officer Martinez, approached me gently. "Mississippi, are you sure you weren't dreaming? Stress can sometimes." I wasn't dreaming, I insisted, showing them the handprint on the pillow. "Look, this is real." They examined it, exchanging a glance. "Could be condensation." The other officer suggested, "A leaky roof, perhaps." "It's not raining," I snapped, frustration bubbling over. "I'm telling you, someone was here." They took a report but left without providing any real reassurance. Feeling more isolated than ever, I called my friend Jess. She arrived within the hour, wrapping me in a tight hug the moment she walked through the door. "Thank God you're here," I whispered, fighting back tears. "Of course, you shouldn't be alone after that." We stayed up the rest of the night, huddled together on the couch. Jess tried to lighten the mood, but an undercurrent of unease lingered. The next day, I contacted Mr. Jenkins again, demanding answers. There must be some history to this place. Pressed, "Has anyone ever reported strange occurrences?" He hesitated before sighing heavily. "I didn't want to worry you, but the previous tenant did mention odd happenings. She moved out suddenly, wouldn't give a reason. Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, anger and fear mixing. I thought she was just trying to break the lease. You know how students can be, desperate for answers. I delved into researching the house's history. At the local library, I combed through old newspapers and public records. What I found chilled me to the bone. In the 1950s, a man named William Hargrave owned the property. He was a recluse, rumored to dabble in dark rituals. Neighbors reported hearing chants and seeing strange lights. One day, he vanished without a trace. The house sat abandoned for years until it was renovated into apartments. Armed with this information, I sought out anyone who might know more. An elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, who lived down the street, agreed to speak with me. "William was a troubled soul," she said, her cloudy eyes distant. "They say he opened a door to something that shouldn't have been let in." "What happened to him?" I asked. She shook her head. "Some believe he never left, that he's trapped between worlds, searching for a way back." I felt a coldness settle within me. "Is there any way to help him move on?" She regarded me carefully. "Sometimes, the past clings too tightly, but perhaps acknowledgement is a start." That night, I returned home determined to confront whatever was haunting me. Jess insisted on joining me, and together we prepared a circle of candles, sage for cleansing, and a firm resolve. We sat in the living room, the air thick with anticipation. I called out into the silence, "William, if you're here, we acknowledge your presence. Please, tell us what you need." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a soft creaking from upstairs. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, descending the staircase. Jess grabbed my hand tightly. We watched as a shadow appeared at the edge of the room. The figure materialized, the same man from before, his form flickering like a fading projection. "William," I ventured. His eyes met mine, less hollow now, filled with a deep sorrow. He raised a hand, pointing toward the bookshelf. Following his gesture, I noticed one book out of place, a worn leather journal that hadn't been there before. I retrieved it, the cover embossed with his initials. Opening it, I found pages filled with writings, confessions, regrets, pleas for forgiveness. "He wants us to know his story," Jess whispered. We spent hours reading, uncovering the tale of a man consumed by grief after losing his family in a tragic accident. In his despair, he'd sought out forbidden practices, hoping to reunite with them. Instead, he tethered himself to the very house where his pain originated. As dawn broke, we felt a shift in the atmosphere, a lightening, as if a weight had been lifted. "Thank you," a faint voice echoed, barely audible. The apparition of William stood by the window, a gentle smile on his face. Slowly, he faded, the first rays of sunlight casting the room in a golden glow. In the days that followed, the house felt different, warmer, peaceful. The footsteps ceased, and the oppressive presence was gone. I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. I shared William's journal with a local historian, ensuring his story would be remembered, his existence acknowledged. Though the experience left an indelible mark on me, It also taught me compassion for the unseen burdens others may carry. Sometimes, the past lingers, not to haunt us, but in search of closure. And sometimes, all it takes is a listening ear and an open heart to set restless spirits free. But every so often, when the wind is just right and the house settles in the night, I think I hear a faint footstep, a gentle reminder of a soul once lost but now at peace. Story number 5. I remember the day I moved into that quaint little apartment like it was yesterday, nestled in the heart of the city. It was the perfect blend of urban convenience and quiet solitude. The building was old but well-maintained, with a vintage charm that attracted artists, writers, and young professionals like myself. The front door had one of those heavy, self-locking mechanisms, a feature I appreciated. Given that I lived alone, after a long day at work, I often looked forward to the solitude of my space. That evening was no different. The autumn air was crisp, and the streets were alive with the rustling of leaves and distant sounds of city life. As I approached my door on the 3rd floor, something felt off. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to notice but not enough to immediately alarm someone who wasn't paying attention. I stopped in my tracks, a cold shiver running down my spine. I distinctly remembered locking it that morning. I always did. Living alone in the city teaches you to be cautious. My mind raced through possible explanations. Maybe the door hadn't latched properly? Perhaps maintenance had stopped by unannounced? Unwilling to take any chances, I backed away and headed straight to the lobby to find the building's security guard, Mike, a burly man in his 50s with a kind face and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Hey, Mike," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. I think someone might have been in my apartment. The door was open. He looked up from his newspaper, concern etching lines on his forehead. "Did you go inside?" I shook my head. "No, I thought it'd be best to get you." "Smart thinking. Let's check it out." We took the elevator back up, the silence between us heavy. When we reached my door, it was just as I'd left it, slightly open, a dark sliver revealing nothing of the interior. "Stay behind me," Mike instructed, pulling out a flashlight and a baton. He pushed the door open slowly, calling out, "Security, anyone here?" Silence. We stepped inside. The living room was just as I'd left it. Books stacked haphazardly on the coffee table, a half-empty mug of cold tea on the counter, and my favorite blanket draped over the couch. Everything seemed untouched. "Maybe you forgot to close it all the way?" Mike suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. "I guess it's possible," I conceded, though unease still gnawed at me. "Let's check the other rooms to be sure." We moved through the kitchen and bathroom, both undisturbed. Finally, we approached the bedroom. The door was closed, which struck me as odd. I always left it open to let the air circulate. Mike glanced back at me. I nodded, giving him the go-ahead. He turned the knob and pushed the door open. First glance, the room appeared normal. My bed was unmade, no surprise there, and clothes were strewn about, a consequence of my perpetual indecisiveness about outfits. But then I saw it. Centered perfectly on my pillow was a kitchen knife, its blade glinting ominously under the soft light of the bedside lamp. Next to it, scrawled across the wall in what looked like dark red paint, were the words, "I got IN." My breath caught in my throat. Mike sucked in a sharp breath. "Don't touch anything," he warned, his voice tight. "We're calling the police." Minutes later, 2 officers arrived, their faces grim as they surveyed the scene. They confirmed what I already feared. The substance on the wall was blood. Whose? They couldn't say. "Do you have any enemies? Anyone who might want to scare you?" one of them asked. I shook my head vigorously. "No, none that I can think of. I'm new to the city. I don't know many people yet." They took statements, dusted for fingerprints, and assured me they'd do everything they could to find whoever was responsible. But I could see in their eyes that they didn't hold out much hope. That night, I couldn't bear to stay in the apartment. I packed a bag and checked into a hotel nearby, but sleep eluded me. Every creak of the building, Every distant siren set my nerves on edge. I replayed the day's events over and over, searching for anything I might have missed. The next morning, the landlord called. "I'm so sorry this happened," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice thick with concern. "In all my years, nothing like this has ever occurred." "Thank you," I replied hollowly. "I think I need to find a new place to live." "I understand completely. Let me know if there's anything I can do." The following days were a blur of apartment hunting and restless nights. The police had no updates. No fingerprints matched any in their databases, and there were no witnesses. It was as if the intruder had been a ghost. A week later, as I was sorting through potential listings in a coffee shop, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. Hesitant, I answered. "Hello," a raspy voice whispered. "Enjoying your new place?" My blood turned to ice. "Who is this?" A low chuckle. "See you soon." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, a mix of terror and disbelief washing over me. How did he get my number? How did he know where I was? I rushed to the police station, demanding to speak with the detective handling my case. Detective Ramirez ushered me into his cluttered office. "He called me," I blurted out. "He knows where I am." Ramirez leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Did you recognize the voice?" "No, it was disguised," but he said, "Enjoying your new place." How could he know I was looking for a new apartment unless he's been watching me? Ramirez sighed. "We'll request a trace on your phone, but if he's using disposable cells, it might be hard to track." "That's it," I exclaimed. "I don't feel safe." He broke into my home, left a knife on my bed, wrote on my wall in blood, and now he's stalking me. "We're doing everything we can," he assured me, though his tone suggested otherwise. Feeling utterly alone, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I purchased new locks for my apartment, which I hadn't yet given up, and installed additional security cameras inside and out. I even bought pepper spray and a personal alarm. That night, exhaustion finally overtook me, and I fell into a fitful sleep on the couch, the TV casting a dim light across the room. A loud thud jolted me awake. Disoriented, I glanced at the clock, 3:15 a.m. The room was eerily silent. Then, another thud, this time closer. My heart raced. I reached for my phone, but it was dead, a rookie mistake not to charge it. Gripping the pepper spray tightly, I crept toward the hallway. From the shadows, a figure emerged, a man dressed in dark clothes, a hood obscuring his face. He stood there, motionless, as if waiting for me to notice him. "Get out!" I screamed, my voice shaking. He tilted his head, almost curiously. "I told you," he whispered, his voice unmistakably the same as on the phone. I got in. He took a step toward me. Without thinking, I unleashed the pepper spray, aiming for his face. He recoiled, cursing, but quickly regained composure. The spray hadn't affected him. Panic surged. I turned and bolted toward the front door, fumbling with the locks. Before I could open it, he grabbed my wrist, his grip vice-like. "Let me go!" I shrieked, struggling against him. He leaned in close. "No one leaves until I'm done." In a desperate move, I stomped on his foot and elbowed him in the ribs. He grunted, loosening his grip just enough for me to break free. I tore open the door and dashed into the hallway, screaming for help. Neighbors peeked out, alarmed. One man, Mr. Harris from 4B, rushed to my aid. "What's happening?" "He's in my apartment," I cried. "Call the police." Mr. Harris ushered me into his unit, locking the door behind us. He handed me his phone, and I dialed 911 with trembling fingers. Within minutes, sirens wailed outside. Officers stormed the building. But when they entered my apartment, the intruder was gone. No signs of forced entry. No evidence he had been there at all. Detective Ramirez arrived, skepticism etched on his face. "Are you sure you saw someone?" I glared at him. "I'm not making this up. He attacked me." "We'll review the security footage," he said. But when they pulled the recordings, the files were corrupted. Static and distortions obscured any useful images. It was as if the cameras had malfunctioned at the exact moment I needed them most. Feeling defeated, I stayed with a friend for several nights, but I couldn't hide forever, determined not to let fear control my life. I returned home, though every creak and shadow set me on edge. One evening, as I was double-checking the new locks, I noticed a small envelope slip under the door. Hands shaking, picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single photograph of me sleeping on the couch, the night he'd confronted me. Scrawled on the back were the words, "Sweet dreams." That was the final straw. I packed a bag and drove until dawn, ending up in a motel miles away. From there, I contacted a private security firm, explaining my situation. They agreed to conduct a thorough sweep of my apartment. The team found several hidden cameras and listening devices, inside smoke detectors, electrical outlets, even a stuffed animal I kept on a shelf. They also discovered that the automatic locking mechanism on my door had been tampered with, allowing it to appear locked when it wasn't. Who could have done this? I asked, horrified. Someone with access and technical expertise. The lead technician replied grimly. A chilling thought crossed my mind. Like, the security guard always around, always helpful. Could it be? I relayed my suspicions to Detective Ramirez, who seemed skeptical but agreed to investigate. Days later, Ramirez called me in. We questioned Mike. His alibi checks out, but we did find something interesting. Your landlord, Mrs. Thompson, has a son, David. He's a convicted felon with a history of stalking and breaking and entering. My mind raced. I'd never met or even heard of her son. Where is he now? I demanded. That's the thing, we can't locate him. Mrs. Thompson claims she hasn't seen him in months, feeling a mix of vindication and dread. Pressed. What do we do now? We've issued a warrant for his arrest. In the meantime, we recommend you stay somewhere safe. But nowhere felt safe. That night, holed up in yet another motel. I bolted awake to the sound of tapping on the window. I glanced at the clock. 2 a.m. The room was on the second floor. Heart pounding. I crept toward the window, pulling the curtain aside ever so slightly. Staring back at me was a pair of cold, dark eyes. I stumbled backward, stifling a scream. The window began to rattle as he tried to force it open. Frantic, I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, but before I could speak, the line went dead. The lights flickered and then darkness engulfed the room. A voice whispered from outside, muffled but clear, "You can't hide from me." Desperation took over. I felt along the wall for the door, yanked it open, and sprinted down the hallway, banging on every door. "Help! Someone help me!" Doors opened as groggy guests peered out. A man stepped forward. "What's going on?" "Someone's trying to break into my room." He nodded, understanding the urgency. "Stay with us." We huddled in the hallway as the motel manager called the police. Sirens wailed in the distance as the intruder fled into the night. The police arrived, but as before, he was gone without a trace. I knew then that I couldn't keep running. This man, David, wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. Whatever that was. With no other options, I decided to confront Mrs. Thompson. Maybe she knew more than she was letting on. The next morning, I arrived at her office. She looked up, surprised. "Dear, I wasn't expecting you." "Cut the act," I snapped. "I know about your son." Her face paled. I don't know what you mean." "He's been stalking me, breaking into my home, terrorizing me, and I think you've been helping him." Tears welled in her eyes. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt. He's sick. Ever since his father died, he's been different. That doesn't excuse what he's done. I've tried to get him help," she pleaded, "but he disappears for months. I don't know what he's capable of." "Then you need to tell the police everything." She nodded slowly. "You're right. I'll do whatever it takes to stop this." With her cooperation, The police were able to track David's movements. They set up a sting operation, using me as bait. It was risky, but I was beyond fear. I wanted my life back. The plan was simple. I would return to my apartment, and undercover officers would be stationed nearby. Night fell, and I waited, every nerve on edge. Hours passed with no sign of him. Just when I began to think he wouldn't show, a noise shattered the silence. The sound of glass breaking from the fire escape window. He was inside. I signaled the officers via a hidden earpiece. "He's here. Stay calm," Ramirez's voice instructed. "We're moving in." Footsteps approached my bedroom door. The knob turned slowly. I backed away as the door creaked open, revealing David's shadowy figure. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, trying to keep him talking. He stepped forward, a twisted smile on his face. "Because you need me. You just don't know it yet." "That's not true." He tilted his head. "We could have been happy." At that moment, the room flooded with light as officers burst in, weapons drawn. "Hands up!" they shouted. David lunged toward me, but they were quicker. They tackled him to the ground, cuffing him as he spat curses. Relief washed over me as they led him away. It was over. In the aftermath, I moved to a new city, changed my name, started fresh. The nightmares still lingered, but with time, they faded. I learned that monsters aren't always lurking in the shadows. Sometimes, they're people hiding in plain sight, wearing friendly faces. So now, I double lock my doors, trust my instincts, and never ignore the slightest sign that something is amiss. Because I know all too well what can happen when we let our guard down. And I won't let fear rule my life again. Story number 6. I never thought that the glow of a computer screen could become a beacon for something far more sinister than any monster in a video game. Yet here I am, recounting a night that has forever blurred the lines between reality and the nightmares that haunt me. It was a typical Saturday night, or so I thought. My parents were out of town for the weekend, leaving me alone in our suburban home. At 18, I relished the freedom. I stocked up on energy drinks and snacks, ready to dive into an all-night gaming marathon with my online friends. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the central air and the distant chirping of crickets outside. My gaming setup was in my bedroom, a modest space cluttered with posters, figurines, and the detritus of teenage life. The glow from my dual monitors bathed the room in a cool blue light, casting long shadows that danced with every movement on the screen. Around midnight, we started a new quest in an expansive online RPG. Time slipped away as we strategized and battled, the real world fading into the background. Hours later, as the clock neared 3 a.m., we decided to take a quick break before tackling the final boss. I leaned back in my chair, stretching my arms above my head. My neck was stiff, and my eyes ached from staring at the screen. "Be right back," I typed into the chat. I took a swig of my energy drink, the carbonation tingling down my throat. The game began to load the next area, and the screen went black. In that brief moment of darkness, I caught a glimpse of something that made my heart skip a beat. There, in the reflection of the monitor, was the silhouette of a person standing directly behind me. A surge of adrenaline shot through me. I whipped around in my chair, my eyes scanning the dimly lit room. Nothing. The door was closed, and the shadows were still. I let out a nervous laugh, chastising myself for being jumpy. "Get it together," I muttered. I turned back to the screen, which had finished loading. My character stood idle in the game world, but my focus was shattered. I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure. "Everything okay?" One of my friends messaged. "Yeah, thought I saw something. Probably just tired," I replied. We pressed on, but my enthusiasm had waned. Every creak of the house seemed amplified, every shadow more ominous. After another half hour, I decided to call it a night. Logging off, I typed, "Catch you guys tomorrow." I shut down the computer, and the room plunged into darkness before my eyes adjusted. The faint glow from the streetlights outside seeped through the curtains. I stood up, intending to head to the bathroom to brush my teeth. As I opened my bedroom door, a cold draft greeted me. Odd, the air conditioning shouldn't have made it that chilly. The hallway was darker than usual. I reached for the light switch, flicking it on. Nothing happened. Great, I sighed. Bulbs out. Using my phone's flashlight, I navigated to the bathroom. After washing up, I made my way back to my room. Just as I was about to close the door, I heard a soft thud downstairs. I froze, straining to listen. Silence. Probably the ice maker, I told myself. Or maybe the house settling. I wasn't convinced. Back in my room, I locked the door, a habit ever since I'd started staying home alone. I crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. The glow of my phone screen provided a small comfort as I scrolled mindlessly through social media, trying to lull myself to sleep. A notification popped up, a motion alert from the security camera in our living room. We had installed a few cameras around the house for peace of mind. Usually, the alerts were triggered by our cat, Whiskers, but she was staying with my grandparents while my parents were away. Curious, I opened the security app. The thumbnail showed a grainy image of the living room in night vision, bathed in shades of gray and black. First, I saw nothing unusual. Then, a slight movement caught my eye. In the corner of the frame, a shadow shifted near the base of the stairs. My breath caught. I watched intently as the figure of a person stepped into view, moving slowly across the living room. The intruder was tall and wore dark clothing, a hood obscuring their face. Panic gripped me. This was real. I scrambled out of bed, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. 911. What's your emergency? The operator answered. There's someone in my house. I whispered, my voice barely audible. I'm upstairs. Please send help. Stay calm, she said soothingly. What's your address? I provided the information, all the while keeping an eye on the live feed. The intruder was ascending the stairs. He's coming upstairs, I whispered. Lock yourself in a room if you can. Officers are en route. I moved as quietly as possible, turning the lock on my bedroom door and pushing a chair under the handle for good measure. My mind raced. There was no safe way out. The only exit was through the window. But my room was on the second floor. The security feed showed the intruder reaching the top of the stairs. He paused, turning his head as if listening. Then, he proceeded down the hallway toward my parents' bedroom. He's on the second floor, I informed the operator. Stay on the line, she said. Officers will be there shortly. I muted my phone to silence any potential noise and stood there, holding my breath. Footsteps echoed softly outside my room, slow and deliberate. They stopped right outside my door. A gentle jiggle of the doorknob. I bit down on my lip to keep from making a sound. The jiggling became more forceful, followed by a heavy thud as the intruder tried to force the door open. The chair held for now. Come on, come on. I silently urged the police to arrive. Suddenly, everything went quiet. The assault on the door ceased. I checked the security feed. The intruder was no longer visible. He's not at the door anymore. I whispered into the phone. Stay where you are. The operator instructed. Minutes passed in agonizing silence. Then, flashing red and blue lights illuminated my curtains. A muffled voice boomed from outside. This is the police. Is anyone inside? Relief flooded over me. I unblocked the door and carefully made my way downstairs after confirming with the operator that it was safe. The police searched the house thoroughly. The front door was unlocked, but there were no signs of forced entry. The intruder was gone. Are you sure you locked all the doors? One of the officers asked. Yes, positive. I insisted. I always double-check when I'm alone. They reviewed the security footage. The cameras had captured the intruder entering through the back door, which had been left ajar. That's impossible, I said. I never used the back door, and I know I locked it. Sometimes locks can malfunction. The officer suggested, We'll have a patrol car keep an eye on the area tonight." After they left, I sat in the living room, still shaken. I couldn't understand how the back door had been unlocked. Exhaustion eventually overtook me, and I dozed off on the couch with all the lights on. The next morning, I decided to check the security footage more thoroughly. Sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop, I scrolled back to earlier in the evening, before the first alert. At around 1 a.m., the camera facing the backyard showed slight movement near the fence line. I squinted, leaning closer. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with practiced stealth. He approached the back door, pausing to look around before reaching into his pocket and pulling out what looked like a set of tools. He picked the lock effortlessly. "How did the police miss this?" I muttered. I continued watching as he entered the house, disappearing from view, switching to the indoor cameras. I tracked his movements. He lingered in the kitchen, rifling through drawers silently. Then he moved to the living room, standing eerily still for several minutes. My heart pounded as I realized he was listening, possibly hearing me upstairs. Then came the most chilling part. The intruder ascended the stairs slowly, instead of heading toward my parents' room first. As I'd thought, he came directly to my bedroom door. The camera in the hallway captured him standing outside my room, his face obscured by the hood. He raised a gloved hand and lightly traced the outline of my doorframe, almost tenderly. I felt sick. He then moved to my parents' room, spending a few minutes inside before returning to stand outside my door again. This time, he leaned in, pressing his ear against the wood. "Why?" I whispered as I watched. He pulled something from his pocket, a small object I couldn't make out, and placed it on the floor by my door. I paused the video and rushed upstairs. Cautiously, I approached my bedroom door, examining the floor. There, barely visible against the hardwood, was a tiny USB drive. How had I missed it before? I picked it up with a tissue and brought it back to the kitchen. Against my better judgment, I plugged it into the laptop. A single video file appeared, labeled with a smiley face. I clicked on it. The screen was dark at first, but audio began to play, a soft rustling, footsteps on carpet. Then, the video came into focus. It was a recording of me, sitting at my desk, gaming. The angle suggested it was filmed from behind, possibly from the doorway of my room. I watched in horror as the intruder stepped into frame, standing directly behind me. He was so close he could have reached out and touched me. For 10 minutes, he stood there, unmoving, watching me as I played, oblivious to his presence. Occasionally, he tilted his head, as if curious. Then, in a moment that made my blood run cold, he looked directly into the camera and lifted a finger to where his lips would be under the hood. A silent shush. The video ended abruptly. I yanked the USB drive out and threw it across the room. Panic enveloped me. This was more than a break-in. It was a twisted game. I called the police again, demanding they return immediately. This time, they took my claims more seriously. They collected the USB drive as evidence and promised to analyze it for any clues. "Do you recognize the man in the video?" the detective asked. "No," I replied shakily. "I've never seen him before. Is there anyone who might have a reason to target you? An ex-boyfriend? Someone you've had a disagreement with?" I shook my head. "No, nothing like that. They increased patrols in the neighborhood and advised me to stay elsewhere for a few days." I packed a bag and went to stay with my friend Alex. Sleep was elusive, and every shadow seemed threatening. Days turned into weeks, and despite the investigation, the intruder was never identified. The police found no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. The sense of violation lingered. I couldn't return home, couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Eventually, my parents decided to sell the house. We moved to a new town, hoping for a fresh start. But even now, the memory haunts me. Every time I sit at a computer, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure lurking behind me. I've become hypervigilant, checking locks obsessively, installing multiple security systems. Friends tell me I'm paranoid, but they don't understand, because somewhere out there, he might still be watching, waiting for the next opportunity to step out of the shadows. And the worst part? I never saw his face. He could be anyone. A stranger passing by, a friendly cashier, a new neighbor. So I share my story as a warning. Be aware of your surroundings. Even in the comfort of your own home, trust your instincts. Because sometimes, the monsters we fear are not in our games or stories. They're real, and they walk among us, hidden in plain sight, and they might just be standing right behind you. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the eerie tales of solitude and fear, from mysterious strangers to haunted dolls. These stories remind us that being home alone is not always as safe as it seems. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more dives into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, when you're alone, you might not truly be alone.